Catherine Reed was used to walking into rooms and being in control, but that afternoon, she stepped into her daughter's nursery and froze. There, on the carpeted floor, lay a man she barely knew. A man with the posture of a soldier, the rough edges of a life lived hard, and the gentlest smile she'd ever seen. Between his arms, her twin baby girls were curled up fast asleep, as if the world outside didn't exist. And for the first time in years, neither did her walls. If you believe some moments can change the course of an entire life, stay with us. And if you'd like to hear more stories of quiet courage, healing, and unexpected kindness, consider subscribing. It helps us bring you more true feeling stories that linger long after they end. Now, let's begin. Rain streaked the wide glass windows of the Kingsley estate, each drop catching the soft glow of the driveway lamps. Catherine Kingsley stepped out of her black sedan, the sound of her heels muted by the heavy downpour. She had not planned to be home this early. The final meeting in Chicago had been canceled last minute, and instead of staying the night at her hotel, she had taken the first flight back. She wanted to see her children. She told herself it was just to check in, make sure the new nanny had things under control. But deep down, she missed them in a way she rarely admitted. Inside, the house was still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from emptiness, but the deep, velvety quiet of a home that is settled for the night. Her assistant had already gone home. The night staff kept their respectful distance. Catherine moved down the long marble hall toward the west wing, her heels clicking in a slow rhythm. As she passed the kitchen, she noticed the faint scent of chamomile tea lingering in the air, along with something else. Laundry detergent, clean and comforting. The twins' bedroom was at the very end. She reached for the brass handle, hesitated for a beat, then turned it slowly. The door creaked just enough to make her wince. A warm, golden light spilled from the bedside lamp, and the soft patter of rain against the window filled the space. What she saw next stopped her breath. On the floor, between the twin beds, lay Mason Cole. His tall frame was curled just enough to fit beneath the shared blanket that covered him, and the two small bodies beside him. One of his arms was draped protectively over the children, his hand resting lightly on the back of the smaller twin. The other child's tiny hand was clutching the fabric of his sleeve. Their faces, peaceful and slack with sleep, pressed into the warmth of the blanket. The air was thick with the mingled scent of rain-damp clothes and the faint sweetness of baby shampoo. Mason's hair was a little messy, as if he'd run his hands through it one too many times before exhaustion took over. His breathing was slow, steady. His face, in repose, carried lines that spoke of years spent seeing too much and saying too little. His uniform jacket was folded neatly at the foot of one bed, leaving him in a simple gray t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. His boots were placed side by side, laces tucked in, a soldier's habit he'd never shaken. Catherine's first reaction was confusion. Why was he here? Mason was the night security guard, not the nanny. She had never authorized him to be anywhere near her children's bedroom, let alone asleep on the floor with them. A flash of irritation prickled at her, the same reflex she had toward any breach of her strict household rules. But before she could summon the will to wake him, something in the scene held her still. The children. They were relaxed in a way she rarely saw. Even with the best nannies, bedtime had always been a struggle, especially after the divorce. They woke often, restless, sometimes crying out. But now, both of them were wrapped around this man as if he were the anchor in their small, uncertain world. And he was lying there, not on a guest chair or leaning against the wall, but on the hard wooden floor, sharing the thin blanket with them. She stepped inside quietly, her designer heels sinking into the plush rug. The closer she got, the more she noticed. The twins' breathing matched his, a perfect, unspoken rhythm. The tension she had grown accustomed to seeing in their little bodies was gone. She thought she saw the faintest smile tug at the corner of Mason's mouth as one of the twins murmured something in her sleep. Catherine had met Mason only a few weeks earlier when her head of security recommended him for the night shift. A veteran, they'd said, with a clean record and an unshakable sense of duty. She had barely spoken to him, just enough to note that he was polite, concise, and kept his eyes respectfully lowered. He was here to work, nothing more. And yet, here he was. Her mind flickered to all the possibilities. Had something happened? Did the nanny leave? Was one of the twins sick? But no. The soft rise and fall of their chests told her they were fine. It was something else, something that didn't fit neatly into a column on a staff report. And that unsettled her. She lingered at the doorway, torn between waking him and letting the moment stretch. The rain outside deepened, a steady percussion against the glass, and she found herself unwilling to break the fragile bubble of peace in the room. Mason shifted slightly, tucking the blanket closer around the smaller twin without opening his eyes. His hand lingered there, protective, as if he'd done it in his sleep 100 times before. Catherine's pulse slowed. The irritation she'd felt melted into something unfamiliar. Warmth, yes, but laced with a hint of vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself in years. For a moment, she wasn't the millionaire CEO returning from a business trip. She was just a mother, standing in the quiet, watching her children sleep safe in the care of a man she barely knew. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back. She ignored it. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, studying the lines of Mason's face, the rough stubble on his jaw, the way his presence seemed to steady the entire room. And she wondered, not for the first time that night, what kind of man sleeps on a cold floor just to keep 2 children from waking alone? That question, she knew, was going to stay with her. The morning light in the Kingsley estate was soft, but cold, spilling across the polished floors in thin ribbons. Catherine stood at the head of the breakfast table, her coffee cooling in her hand. She had been up since dawn, replaying the image of Mason sleeping on the floor with her twins. At first, she'd told herself it was a one-time lapse in judgment, but as the hours passed, that explanation felt too neat, too easy. When Mason appeared in the doorway, his uniform jacket buttoned to the collar, hair damp from an early shower, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I'd like to know," she began, her voice low but firm, "why you were in my children's room last night." He didn't flinch. He just stepped inside, standing with his weight balanced like someone used to being evaluated. "They couldn't sleep," he said simply. "I stayed until they did." "That doesn't answer my question," Catherine pressed. "Why were you in there at all? That's not your job." Mason's gaze shifted, not evasively, but as if choosing his words with care. "The nanny had an emergency. She left early. The twins were awake. I stayed." There was more to it. She could feel it in the pause between his sentences, in the way his shoulders tightened slightly under the crisp fabric of his jacket. But he didn't offer anything else, and Catherine found herself uncomfortably aware of how steady his voice was. "You should have called me," she said, more out of reflex than conviction. "Maybe," Mason replied, eyes meeting hers briefly. But they needed someone right then. Not a phone call. For a moment, Catherine had no answer. She told herself it was because of his tone, calm, measured, without the slightest trace of apology. But the truth was, she'd heard something in those words she didn't want to admit. A quiet certainty, the kind that comes from living through nights far more urgent than this one. As he turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of his forearm where the sleeve had ridden up slightly. A thick, jagged scar curved from his wrist halfway to his elbow, pale against his skin. It wasn't the kind of mark you got from an accident at home. She recognized the shape of it, the kind that came from shrapnel or worse. For reasons she couldn't explain, the sight shifted something in her. Suspicion gave way to a flicker of curiosity. Later that morning, she called her head of security. "Tell me about Mason Cole," she said. The answer came without hesitation. Marine Corps, 2 tours overseas. Came back with an honorable discharge. No criminal record. Lost his wife to illness 3 years ago. Raising a 9-year-old son on his own. Lives in the Riverstone housing complex. The details landed harder than she expected. She pictured the man she'd seen last night, on the floor with her children, steady and quiet, and tried to reconcile him with the image of a soldier returning from war, carrying scars both seen and unseen. By mid-morning, the calm in the house had fractured. It started in the service hallway near the laundry room, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Drummond, cornered Catherine with a look of moral outrage. "I have to speak plainly, Miss Kingsley," the older woman said. "That man overstepped. Sleeping in the children's room? That's not proper." Catherine held her expression neutral. The circumstances were unusual. The nanny left unexpectedly. Mrs. Drummond's lips pressed into a thin line. "All the more reason to follow protocol. He's the security guard, not family. It's not his place to put himself in that position." The words, "not his place," hung in the air like smoke. Catherine had heard that tone before, in boardrooms, in fundraisers, in quiet country clubs where rules were unspoken but ironclad. The implication was clear. Lines had been crossed. By noon, the murmurs had spread. A pair of junior staff were whispering near the pantry. A driver lingered by the kitchen door, glancing away when she passed. The estate, usually a well-oiled machine, had developed a subtle but unmistakable tension. Catherine found Mason in the security office, reviewing footage from the previous night. "I'm hearing complaints," she said, stepping inside. He didn't look up from the screen. "I figured you would. You're being accused of overstepping." Now he looked at her, eyes level. "If keeping 2 scared kids company counts as overstepping, then yes, I did." It was blunt, and it carried a weight that silenced her for a moment. "People are concerned about boundaries," she said finally. "Boundaries," Mason repeated, as if tasting the word. "I've seen what happens when they're used to keep people from doing what's right." There was no malice in his voice, just a quiet conviction that made it harder to dismiss him outright. Catherine realized, with a small jolt, that this man wasn't going to explain himself in the way she was used to. He would not beg for approval or craft a story to smooth over her discomfort. As she left the room, the low murmur of the rain from the night before still seemed to echo in her mind. She didn't yet know if she trusted him, but she knew one thing with certainty. This was not the last time Mason Cole would unsettle her carefully ordered world. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the Kingsley estate bathed in a pale winter light. Catherine stood at the edge of the nursery, her arms folded loosely across her chest. The room was quiet, too quiet for children their age. The silence wasn't new. It was a constant hum in the background of her life, but it still pressed against her like a weight she couldn't lift. She had learned to stop expecting chatter, laughter, or the spontaneous squeals that once filled these walls. Ever since her husband's death 2 years ago, Anna and Lily had retreated into a world of their own, speaking in brief whispers to each other, and almost never to anyone else. The string of nannies she'd hired, some with glowing references, others with degrees in child psychology, had all left within a week, worn down not by tantrums or misbehavior, but by the unyielding quiet. When Catherine mentioned it to Mason that morning, she expected a flicker of surprise, maybe pity. Instead, he simply nodded, as if the information settled into a place he already understood. "They don't need questions right now," he said. or pressure. They need space to decide for themselves when to let someone in. She almost laughed, softly, not mockingly. And you think you can get through to them by giving them space? I don't think, he replied, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I know. By afternoon, Catherine found him in the playroom, not standing guard by the door like security staff usually did, but sitting cross-legged on the carpet. A blanket was spread beside him. On it, small wooden blocks were stacked in uneven towers, some leaning precariously, others toppled into colorful piles. Anna sat opposite him, her blonde hair falling in loose strands around her face, clutching a red block. Lily was closer to the wall, knees tucked under her dress, watching but not moving. Mason didn't speak. He didn't gesture for them to come closer or tell them what to do. He simply picked up 2 blocks and began stacking, slow and deliberate, as if he had nowhere else in the world to be. Minutes passed. The quiet in the room shifted, less like a barrier, more like a waiting space. Anna edged forward first, her small hand setting a block on top of his stack. Mason didn't comment, just moved a different block closer to her. The simple, unspoken exchange repeated until Anna was kneeling on the blanket beside him. Then, unexpectedly, she tugged at his sleeve. Mason glanced down. She pointed toward a mismatched pile of blocks and then to an empty corner of the blanket. He understood immediately. She wanted to start a new tower. Across the room, Lily's lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't much, but for Catherine, watching unseen from the doorway, it was more progress than any nanny had made in months. After nearly half an hour, Mason reached for the folded napkin sitting on the low table. "Want to see something?" he asked. Not to both, not loudly, but gently, his eyes flicking from Anna to Lily. He flattened the napkin on the blanket, smoothing its edges. Then, with precise, deliberate folds, he shaped it into a sharp, triangular pennant. "This," he said quietly, "is a battle flag. You carry it when you have to move forward, no matter how scared you are." Anna tilted her head, watching intently. Lily, for the first time, slid a little closer. Mason handed the flag to Anna, then took another napkin and began folding again. Slower this time, letting the girls see each step. The corners tucked in just so, the center crease pressed firm, the triangle forming like a secret revealed. When he finished, he placed it in front of Lily. She didn't touch it right away, but her gaze stayed fixed on the small white flag. "You keep it," Mason said softly. "Both of you. It's a reminder. Every time you feel like hiding, you remember you've still got it in you to stand." Catherine felt a strange pull in her chest. There was no grand speech, no coaxing, just a simple ritual, done with the kind of care that made even a folded napkin feel like something sacred. And yet, there was something in his tone, a gravity, that hinted at a past most people couldn't imagine. Later, as the girls drifted back to their corner with the flags in hand, Mason stayed seated on the floor, stacking the last of the blocks alone. He didn't look toward the doorway, but Catherine had the odd sense he knew she was there. When she turned to leave, she caught herself glancing at the napkins again. She didn't know what battles this man had fought, or why he carried them quietly in his shoulders and in his hands. But she knew one thing. He was changing the air in her house, and not by force. It was something far rarer. The sky had been gray all afternoon, but by 3 o'clock, the rain came in hard, pounding the estate's glass windows like fists. Catherine was upstairs in her study, a dozen faces staring at her from the conference screen. The quarterly meeting had already run long. She barely noticed the shift in the rhythm of the storm outside. Downstairs, the house was oddly quiet. The temporary nanny, hired just 2 days earlier, had vanished somewhere between the kitchen and the staff lounge, muttering something about needing to make a phone call. Mason, making his usual rounds, paused at the end of the hallway that overlooked the back garden. Through the rain-streaked glass, a flash of movement caught his eye. A small figure darting across the lawn, dress plastered to her legs by the downpour. Anna. He didn't think. He just moved. Boots splashed through the tiled entry as he shoved open the rear door. The cold hit him first, then the sound. The unrelenting hammer of rain, the wind twisting his shirt against his back. Anna was halfway across the yard, her blonde hair a wet halo. She was calling out for something, though her voice was swallowed by the storm. Then he saw it. A small tabby cat perched precariously on the stone edge of the ornamental pond. The water below churned from the force of the rain, the slick stones glistening like glass. "Anna!" Mason's voice cut through the weather, firm but not loud enough to frighten her. She didn't look back. One tiny foot slid on the soaked grass, her arms flailing for balance. He was already running. The ground under him was mud and hidden roots. His boots skidded more than once. He closed the gap just as she stepped onto the first stone of the pond's border. A single, terrible second. Her foot slipped sideways, her center of gravity tipping toward the dark water. Mason lunged, his arm hooking around her small frame. He twisted as they fell, his back taking the brunt as they hit the wet ground. The impact drove the breath from his lungs. A sharp sting flared along his forearm where it had scraped a jagged rock. Anna clung to him, eyes wide, her chest heaving. The cat bolted to safety on its own, tail high, as if nothing had happened. Above them, from the second-floor balcony, Catherine had come to investigate the commotion. She stood frozen, hands gripping the railing, watching the man who only days ago had been a name on a staff roster. The rain blurred everything, softened the edges, but she could see the instinct in his movements, the way he had shielded her child without a second's hesitation. Mason shifted to his knees, one arm still steady around Anna. "You okay?" he asked, searching her face. She gave a small nod, then buried her head against his chest. By the time they reached the covered patio, Catherine was already there, umbrella forgotten on the chair behind her. She knelt beside Anna, brushing wet hair from her daughter's face. "Go inside, sweetheart. Get dry clothes." Anna hesitated, then slipped away toward the house. Catherine's gaze moved to Mason. His shirt clung to him, the fabric torn at the sleeve where blood mixed with rainwater. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing." He glanced at the scrape, flexed his fingers. Better me than her. It should have been simple, gratitude, perhaps even a thank you, but the moment fractured almost immediately. From the far end of the patio, Richard Cole, the estate's head of security, stepped forward. His voice was sharp, cutting through the sound of the rain. "You had no authorization to leave your post," Richard said. "You're here to handle security, not chase cats and play hero. That's for the domestic staff." Mason's jaw tightened. She was about to fall in. "You still broke protocol." Richard's eyes flicked toward Catherine. "For the safety of the household, I recommend he be reassigned off-site immediately." The words hung in the damp air. Catherine's instinct was to argue, but part of her knew Richard wasn't wrong about the rules. The staff was meant to stay in their lanes. Boundaries existed for a reason. And yet, she could still see Mason in the rain, his body twisting mid-fall, so Anna wouldn't hit the ground, the protective way his arms had wrapped around her. "Let me think on it," she said finally. Richard gave a curt nod and stepped back, but Mason's eyes stayed steady on hers. There was no plea there, no defensiveness, just a quiet certainty that he'd do it all again if it meant keeping the child safe. When Catherine returned to her meeting, the voices of her colleagues blurred into background noise. All she could see was the image from the balcony, framed in the storm. A man who claimed no authority, no special role, and yet had acted as if it was the only role that mattered. She wasn't sure what troubled her more, the break in protocol, or the fact that for the first time in years, she'd felt something she couldn't quite name. The rain had stopped by the time Mason's shift ended, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the jaundiced glow of street lamps. He took the bus to the edge of town, the ride long enough for the adrenaline of the afternoon to fade into a dull ache in his arm and a sharper one in his chest. His building was the kind of place no one photographed for rental listings, paint curling away from the bricks, mailboxes dented and rust-stained. He climbed the narrow stairwell to the second floor, key ready in hand. When the door opened, the smell of something warm and faintly sweet greeted him. Eli was sitting cross-legged on the worn couch, a school workbook open on his lap. The boy looked up, his grin immediate. "Dad, you're home." Mason's shoulders eased. He closed the door behind him, setting his bag down in the corner. The apartment was small. 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and a bathroom with a door that didn't quite shut all the way. The wallpaper had peeled in long strips near the window, and the refrigerator hummed like it was straining to breathe. Inside, it held only a carton of milk, half a loaf of bread, and a jar of peanut butter. Yet somehow, it felt full, because of the boy. Eli hopped off the couch and crossed the room in a few steps. "You're soaked," he said, touching his father's damp sleeve. "Caught in the rain," Mason replied with a faint smile. He tousled Eli's hair, then lowered himself onto the couch. "How was school?" The boy shrugged. "Math test tomorrow. I think I got it." His eyes searched Mason's face, as if measuring how much he could ask. "Everything okay at work?" "Fine." The answer was automatic, but Eli seemed satisfied enough. They shared a quiet moment, the only sound the hum of the fridge and the occasional car passing below. Later, when Eli had gone to bed, Mason sat in the dim kitchen, his forearms resting on the table. The scrape on his arm stung faintly, but that wasn't what kept him awake. The flashback came without warning, sharp, intrusive. He was back in the desert, the sun a white fire overhead. His unit had been ordered to hold position until evac, but a call came through. 2 children spotted in the open, too close to an active field. Mason had made the choice to go after them. His sergeant had shouted the order to stand down, but Mason had already moved. By the time he reached the children, gunfire had erupted. The evac came late. In the chaos, one of his closest friends, Staff Sergeant Dale Turner, was hit. Mason had carried him half a mile before realizing the truth. Dale was gone. That decision had cost him more than a commendation. It had planted a weight inside his chest that never left, even after discharge. The nightmares, the what-ifs, the endless second-guessing. It was all there, stitched into the fabric of his days. And maybe that was why, when he saw a child in danger, any child, he couldn't just stand still. Across town, Catherine sat in her own kitchen, far removed from the crumbling paint and the hum of a tired refrigerator. The estate was silent except for the low murmur of the dishwasher. Her mind kept circling back to the image of Mason in the rain, the way Anna had clung to him, the blood on his sleeve. She had questions, too many for a simple employee file to answer. And Catherine Kingsley was not a woman who let questions go unanswered. That was how she found herself in the maintenance wing the next morning, seeking out a man named Kyle Barrett. His name had been on a roster she'd skimmed once, ex-military, honorable discharge, now working as part of the estate's facilities team. Kyle was in the workshop, oil-stained hands deep in the guts of a generator. He straightened when he saw her, wiping his palms on a rag. "Ma'am." "Kyle," she said, keeping her voice even. "You served with Mason Hale, didn't you?" His brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Yeah. Back in '09. Why?" "I want to know more about him. The man, not the employee." Kyle hesitated. "That's not a simple story. I have time." Kyle set the rag down, leaning against the workbench. He was one of the best soldiers I ever knew. Smart, steady under fire, but he exhaled slowly. He blames himself for something that wasn't his fault. We were in Kandahar. There was a situation. 2 kids in danger. Mason went after them. We got them out, but we lost Turner that day. Mason never forgave himself. Came back stateside, and never quite put the uniform down, if you know what I mean. Always watching, always ready to step in. Catherine absorbed the words, the pieces of a puzzle starting to align, the way Mason hovered near the twins without smothering them, the instinct in his movements, the quiet weight in his eyes. Kyle continued. He's not the kind of man who'll tell you this himself. Doesn't want pity. He just carries it. And maybe that's why he can't walk away when someone's at risk, especially kids. When Catherine left the workshop, she felt the shift. Her suspicion hadn't evaporated. Years of guardedness didn't vanish in an afternoon. But something else had taken root alongside it. Understanding, maybe. Or something uncomfortably close to respect. Back in his apartment, Mason sat on the floor beside Eli's bed, watching his son sleep. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent. But here, in this small, imperfect space, there was warmth enough to keep the dark at bay. For now, the call came just after sunrise, when the pale light was still spilling cautiously into Mason's kitchen. He had been pouring coffee into a chipped mug, the kind that had survived moves and deployments, when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made him freeze. Catherine Kingsley. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail. Then Eli's sleepy voice floated from the doorway. "Aren't you going to answer, Dad?" Mason thumbed the green icon. "Hello?" Catherine's voice was cool, but not cold. "Mr. Hale, I'd like to speak with you. In person. Today." 2 hours later, Mason stood once again in the marble foyer of the Kingsley estate, feeling like he'd stepped into another world. Catherine was waiting in the sunroom, dressed in a tailored cream blouse, her hair pulled back into a sleek knot. Sunlight caught in the rim of her coffee cup, but her eyes stayed on him. "I've reconsidered," she began. "What happened with Anna? It showed me something I can't ignore. You have instincts I value. But if you come back, it will be under clear, lawful terms. No overnight stays unless explicitly approved. No unsupervised outings without my consent. Everything documented." Mason stood there, hands loosely at his sides, absorbing the words. The offer was a lifeline, but it came with barbed edges. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because the twins respond to you," she said simply, "and because I think you might be the kind of man who can help them find their way back to the world." He didn't answer right away. The memory of his last assignment here, ending in rain, blood, and a security reprimand, still stung. He had failed before. He could fail again. And this time, the cost might not just be his job, but the trust of 2 little girls who'd already lost too much. Catherine's voice softened. "If you'd rather decline, I'll understand." That night, Mason sat at the small kitchen table, the Kingsley contract lying between him and Eli. His son was working through a bowl of cereal, spoon scraping faintly against ceramic. "You don't want to go back?" Eli asked, glancing up. Mason exhaled slowly. "It's not that simple. What if I mess it up again? What if I—" "Dad," Eli interrupted, his voice clear and steady. "If someone believes you can do something good, you don't walk away just because you're scared. You told me once, courage isn't not being afraid. It's doing it anyway." The boy's gaze held his. Mason felt something tighten in his chest, then loosen. The next morning, he returned to the estate. The security gate opened without hesitation this time, but he could feel the eyes of the guards tracking him. Inside, The atmosphere was polite but brittle. A few staff members exchanged stiff nods. Others didn't bother hiding their disapproval. The head housekeeper whispered something to a maid as he passed, her expression pinched. In the playroom, the twins sat on the floor, a half-built train set sprawling across the rug. Anna's hair had come loose from its braid, and Lily was absently twirling a wooden caboose in her hands. When they saw him, Lily's mouth twitched into a shy smile. But Anna stood, clutching a small stuffed fox. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the carpet. Mason crouched to meet her gaze. "Hey, kiddo." She hesitated, eyes darting between his face and the toy in her hands. Then, in a voice so soft he almost thought he'd imagined it, she whispered, "Uncle M." It was the first sound she had made to anyone outside her sister in months. For a beat, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Even Catherine, who had stepped quietly into the doorway, froze where she stood. Mason felt a rush of heat behind his eyes. He swallowed, managing a small smile. "That's me," he said gently. Anna's fingers tightened around the fox before she handed it to him, as if entrusting him with something precious. Catherine didn't speak until later, when they crossed paths in the hall. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I think you made the right choice." So did he. The late afternoon light slanted through the Kingsley Estate's library windows, painting the floor in amber stripes. The twins were in the next room, absorbed in a puzzle, their soft murmurs drifting like the sound of distant waves. Mason sat in one of the deep leather chairs, across from Catherine, a porcelain teacup cradled in her hands. They had started meeting here after the girls' lessons, small, unplanned conversations that grew longer each day. Today, Catherine broke the silence first. "I used to hate this time of day," she said, eyes fixed on the shifting light. "Twilight. My father always left around now, when I was little. Said he had business. Sometimes he never came back for weeks." Mason looked at her, sensing the tension beneath her polished exterior. "You were close to him?" Her lips curved in a faint, humorless smile. "I was close to the idea of him. But every time I thought he'd stay, he didn't. My mother tried, but she was tired. I learned early not to rely too much on anyone. People leave." The last words hung between them like dust in the light. Mason understood that kind of wound, the kind that didn't bleed, but never healed clean. He shifted in his chair. "When I was overseas," he began slowly, "we had a saying. It's not the bullet that kills you, it's the silence afterward. I lost a man once, a friend. My call. Wrong call. I told myself for months that I could have done something different." Catherine's gaze softened. "What did you do?" "What any coward does," he said, his voice low. "I drank, every night. I told myself it was to sleep, but really it was to stop thinking. And it worked, until the day I saw my boy looking at me like I was a stranger. That was the day I stopped." There was no pity in her eyes, only a stillness that felt like respect. "You pulled yourself back." "No," Mason said. "Eli pulled me back. I just followed his voice." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt different, less like employer and employee, more like two people recognizing the fractures in each other's armor. But in another corner of the house, not all ears were friendly. From the shadows near the library door, a slender figure lingered, phone angled subtly. Derek Hanley, one of the senior estate staff, had never trusted Mason. He had his reasons, some personal, some born of simple resentment. The red recording dot blinked quietly as Mason's voice carried. "My call. Wrong call. I told myself for months." The next morning, the estate hummed with a different kind of energy. Mason felt it as soon as he stepped inside. Conversations cut short when he passed, glances exchanged over coffee trays. Even the guards at the gate were unusually terse. By noon, he knew why. In the maintenance hallway, Kyle, his old comrade turned building engineer, pulled him aside. "You should know," Kyle said in a low voice. "Someone's been running their mouth. Says you caused a man's death in the field. And they've got an audio clip." Mason's stomach tightened. "They don't know the whole story." "They don't want the whole story," Kyle replied grimly. "They want you gone." It was a familiar kind of battlefield, this time without sand or rifles. Whispers instead of gunfire, but the same sense of crosshairs on his back. That evening, Catherine found him in the playroom, watching the twins build a cardboard fort. "Something's going on," she said, eyes searching his face. "Half the staff has come to me with concerns. I need to know. Did you say what they claim you said?" "Yes," Mason answered without hesitation. "But not the way they're telling it. I lost someone under my command. I've carried that weight every day since. If that makes me unfit to be around your kids, tell me now." Catherine studied him for a long moment, the quiet crackling between them like static before a storm. "I'll decide that for myself," she said at last, but Mason could see it, the question in her eyes. Not disbelief. Not yet trust. Something in between. The rain started as a whisper against the tall windows of the Kingsley estate, growing into a steady percussion that blurred the city lights beyond the glass. Inside, the house was unusually quiet. Catherine had been called to an emergency board meeting downtown, urgent enough that her driver barely waited for the front gates to close before pulling away. Mason had just finished reading to the twins in their upstairs playroom. Anna was curled under a blanket, fighting sleep, while Lily had fallen asleep mid-doodle, crayon still in hand. The warm hum of the night routine was a sharp contrast to what was brewing miles away in the heart of Catherine's company. Across town, in a steel and glass conference room, voices clashed over a projected spreadsheet. Catherine stood at the head of the table, her jaw set. "If we can't lock down that server breach before the contract review tomorrow, Westbrook Holdings walks. That's $80 million in future revenue gone." Her head of IT shook his head grimly. "The intrusion point traces back to a ping inside the home network. It's possible." He hesitated. "Possible someone had physical access." Catherine felt the chill in those words. The estate. The place she had considered the safest point in her orbit. Back at the mansion, the first sign of trouble came not as sound, but absence. Mason noticed it the way soldiers notice when the wind changes. Too quiet downstairs. Then, faint, the muted click of a latch. He moved silently to the hallway, the rhythm of combat training surfacing like an old reflex. From the staircase landing, he caught a shadow sliding along the wall near the ground floor study. And then, the sound that froze him. Anna's muffled whimper from the bedroom behind him. Two paths opened in his mind. One led down the stairs, toward the study, the server hub, the source of the breach. The other led back to the girls. In war, you calculate the objective. Tonight, the objective was clear. Protect the living. Mason shut the playroom door softly and moved quickly inside, crouching before the twins. "We're going to play a game," he whispered. "Stay under the desk. No sound. No matter what you hear." Anna's wide eyes searched his, and for the first time, Mason saw something beyond fear. Trust. The intruder's footsteps were heavier now, moving toward the hall. Mason slipped out, closing the door without a sound, and positioned himself in the narrow corridor outside the girls' room. The house security alarms, silent for now, hadn't tripped, meaning whoever was here knew the system. A figure emerged from the dim, hood pulled low, a black satchel slung across one shoulder. The man's gaze flicked up in surprise at the sight of Mason. That half-second hesitation was all Mason needed. He moved forward in a controlled burst, catching the man's wrist before it could reach inside his jacket. They hit the wall with a muffled thud. The intruder twisted, striking at Mason's ribs, but Mason pivoted, absorbing the blow and driving the man toward the staircase. The fight was quick, dirty, and without flourish. Both men breathing hard, trading grips and shoves until Mason managed to wrench the satchel free. The intruder bolted down the stairs and into the rain-slicked night, vanishing before Mason could give chase. By the time estate security arrived, delayed by the storm and a suspiciously cut comm line, Mason was standing in the foyer, shirt torn, the satchel at his feet. Inside, a portable drive, still warm from the server connection, and beside it, a smashed handheld device that had been halfway through siphoning files when Mason had stepped in. When Catherine returned an hour later, her hair damp from the storm and her voice edged with exhaustion, the head of security laid out the facts. The breach had deepened while she was gone. The portable drive Mason recovered contained fragments of sensitive data, but not all. The rest was gone. He stayed upstairs, one guard noted, didn't try to secure the server room. Catherine's gaze cut to Mason. Is that true? Mason's answer was steady. Yes. I heard them upstairs first. I wasn't going to leave the girls. Her expression was unreadable, caught between gratitude and frustration. That decision cost us critical data, Mason, the kind we can't get back. They're just files, he said quietly. They're not your daughters. The words hung in the room, heavy and divisive. By morning, the story had already fractured the household. Some staff whispered that Mason was a hero who'd put the girls above everything. Others muttered that he was reckless, that the company's future, and by extension, the twins' security, was tied to that data. And in the middle of it all, Catherine stood at the threshold of two truths, neither of them easy to hold. The storm had passed, but the air in the Kingsley estate was no less heavy. Overnight, headlines had started to leak. Security breach at Kingsley Global, $80 million contract at risk. Catherine had spent the morning moving between damage control calls and curt responses to board members demanding answers. Through it all, Mason's name kept surfacing, not in the press, but in whispered conversations behind closed doors. By noon, Kyle, one of the maintenance leads and the only person in the house who treated Mason like an equal, asked Catherine for a private word. They met in the side garden, where the wet stone still glistened from last night's rain. Kyle didn't waste time. You think Mason screwed up last night, he said, his voice low. But you don't have the whole picture. Catherine crossed her arms, impatient. I have the picture that matters. We lost critical data because he didn't follow protocol. Kyle shook his head. That critical data you're so worried about? Half of it was a ghost file. A lure. She blinked. A lure? Yeah. Mason planted it weeks ago. It's rigged with a tracker, low grade, buried deep. So subtle your IT guys wouldn't even notice unless they were looking for it. And judging from their reaction last night, they weren't. Catherine frowned. Why would he even— Because, Kyle interrupted. The man who broke into your server room isn't just some corporate thief. He's tied to a case Mason's been chasing for years. A little girl went missing, daughter of a guy Mason served with in Kandahar. They never found her. Until a few months back, when a lead pointed straight to a tech broker who sells both stolen data and— He hesitated. And kids. The words hit like cold steel. Catherine's throat tightened. And you're saying the man in my house fits the profile. Mason's been in touch with a detective in missing persons. He offered himself as bait, knowing the guy might try to breach a high-value target. The files he let go? They're tagged. As we speak, that detective is following a breadcrumb trail Mason set. Catherine took a slow breath, the weight of the revelation pressing down. Images from last night replayed in her mind. Mason's steady gaze when she'd accused him, the way he'd said, "They're not your daughters." And if he'd gone to the server room instead of the girls? She asked. Kyle didn't hesitate. That man could have grabbed Anna or Lily, and if he got past the gates with one of them. He let the thought hang, unfinished, but suffocating. For the first time since the breach, Catherine felt the tight knot in her chest shift, not loosening, but changing shape. The outrage she'd been nursing turned into something harder to name, a mix of guilt, gratitude, and the uneasy awareness that she might have misjudged the one man in her home who wasn't afraid to stand up to her. "You should also know," Kyle added. "Mason didn't tell you any of this because the op's still live. The less you knew, the cleaner the chain of custody for whatever the cops catch." Catherine turned toward the main house, her heels crunching on the wet gravel. The sky was clearing now, patches of pale blue breaking through the gray, but her mind was still a storm. Mason had risked his reputation, his job, maybe even his freedom, and he'd done it quietly, without asking for trust first. She found herself wondering if that was bravery, or a man so used to carrying the weight alone that he didn't know how to set it down. The house was still when Mason returned from the long, draining day. The storm in the press had softened, though it hadn't disappeared. For now, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. The girls were safe, the rest could wait. He carried no duffel, no grand gestures, just the old, worn blanket he'd brought that very first week. The same one he'd unfolded on the floor beside the twins' beds when neither would let him near, yet both couldn't seem to sleep without knowing he was close. In the soft light spilling from the hallway, Mason knelt and began spreading the blanket across the hardwood. His hands moved with quiet care, smoothing the creases as if the act itself was a small promise. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. He looked up. Catherine stood at the threshold, still in her silk blouse from the day, her hair slightly loose, not from style, but from fatigue. There was something unguarded in her expression, no trace of the CEO, no shield. Without a word, she stepped into the room. Mason started to rise, but she shook her head. Then, to his quiet surprise, she crossed to the same patch of floor, lowered herself beside him, and sat. The wood was cool under them, the silence so deep they could hear the faint hum of the rain gutters outside. Anna stirred in her bed, her small hand slipping from beneath the covers. Catherine reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, her touch lingering. Lily, already half awake, turned her head toward them, eyes heavy but curious. Mason sat back, watching the way Catherine's shoulders softened in that moment. There was no performance here, no audience, just a mother who'd been holding the world on her back, finally sitting still long enough to feel the weight of her children in her hands. Anna's lips curved faintly in sleep. Lily smiled, small, almost imperceptible, and for the first time since Mason had met them, the air in the room didn't feel fragile. It felt whole. Catherine glanced at Mason, and in that shared look was something unspoken, but undeniable. The walls between them had shifted, not crumbled in a grand collapse, but eased apart, just enough for a bridge to fit. Minutes passed. No one spoke. They didn't need to. When they finally stepped out into the hall, Catherine paused at the railing, looking down at the darkened foyer. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "You were right about one thing. Floors are better than walls. Sometimes you need to meet people where they are, not wait for them to climb up to you." Mason tilted his head. "That work in boardrooms, too?" A corner of her mouth lifted. "Maybe, but I wasn't talking about boardrooms." They walked together toward her study. On her desk lay an open notebook, pages covered in fresh ink. "I want to start something," she said, turning one page toward him. A center for kids of veterans, somewhere they can feel safe. Learn, play, rebuild trust. Most of them have been through more than they should ever have to. Mason's gaze lingered on the sketches, rooms with open spaces, therapy corners, play areas. You're serious about this? Yes. And I don't want just a donation with my name on a plaque. I want it built right. I want you in it from the ground up. He hesitated, hands in his pockets. Why me? Catherine looked him straight in the eye. Because you've lived both sides of it. You know what those kids see in the dark. And you don't just talk about helping. You put your body in the way when it counts. Mason didn't answer right away. He thought of Eli, of the nights he'd wondered if he was enough, if anything he did could undo the damage of his own past. He thought of Anna and Lily, and the way a room could change when they felt safe. Finally, he nodded. Then let's build it, but no walls higher than they have to be. Catherine smiled, genuine, tired, but lighter than he'd ever seen it. Floors, not walls. And for the first time since they'd met, Mason felt like the ground beneath them might actually hold. 1 year later, the old warehouse on the edge of town was unrecognizable. Where once there had been cracked concrete floors and rusted rafters, now sunlight spilled through wide windows onto open play areas, bright murals, and a hum of laughter. The Veterans Children's Support Center had been running for 12 months, long enough for the community to stop calling it Catherine's Project and start calling it Our Place. Long enough for parents who once stood in the doorway, hesitant, to now settle into armchairs with coffee while their kids ran free. Anna and Lily were among the fastest runners. Their hair streamed behind them as they weaved between tables, trading paper airplanes with 2 other kids in wheelchairs. The sight was pure, unfiltered joy, nothing left of the shadows that used to cloud their eyes. Across the gym space, Eli was running drills with the center's volunteer coach. His stride was long, his throws precise. A scholarship letter from a local high school football program was folded neatly in his backpack. Mason had read it 3 times already. He still wasn't sure which meant more, the scholarship itself, or the fact that Eli had started believing he deserved it. That evening, after the last of the children left and the staff locked up, the 5 of them, Mason, Catherine, Eli, Anna, and Lily, walked back to the house together. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth from a storm the night before. Inside, the dining table was set, but untouched. Instead, Mason dropped a folded quilt onto the middle of the living room floor. Anna squealed, and Lily clapped, already grabbing pillows. "Tradition?" Eli asked with a smirk. "Tradition," Mason confirmed. It had started as a necessity, those first nights when walls still felt like barriers, and the floor was the only neutral ground. Somewhere along the way, it had become something else. A choice. Catherine emerged from the kitchen with a tray balanced carefully in her hands. Roasted chicken, buttered rolls, salad tossed in a wooden bowl. She set it on the quilt like it was the most natural thing in the world. They ate cross-legged, plates in their laps, passing food hand to hand instead of across polished wood. Conversation drifted easily. Eli's game next weekend, Lily's new art project, Anna's plan to build a cat castle out of leftover cardboard. Mason listened more than he spoke, his gaze moving from one face to the next, as if memorizing the light in the room. At one point, Catherine looked over at him, catching his eye. For a long second, neither looked away. There was no weight to the silence, only understanding. After the dishes were stacked in the sink and the twins had curled up against Eli for a movie, Catherine shifted closer to Mason on the floor. Her voice was quiet enough that it didn't reach the others. "Some floors aren't meant to be slept on," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "They're meant to be shared." Mason felt something in his chest ease, something that had been braced for years, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He looked around the room again, Eli's arms slung protectively around the girls, the flicker of the television painting warm light across the walls, Catherine sitting close enough for their shoulders to touch. He didn't say it out loud, but the thought was clear. This is it. This is home. And it wasn't built from bricks or shingles or even the perfect safety plan. It was built from trust, from showing up day after day, from learning that walls could keep danger out, but floors could bring people together. Outside, the night settled soft over the house. Inside, laughter spilled across the quilt on the floor, rising and falling like a familiar song. It wasn't the ending Mason would have predicted years ago. It was better. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Your stories and your cities make this community feel like one big living room. If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you join us by subscribing. It helps us keep bringing you more moments of hope, kindness, and second chances. Thank you, truly, for spending your time with us. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.